now.
And so the way that this works is I'll do a short introduction and then we'll look at some photographs together and talk about them. And so when you want to jump in, I'll pose some questions. You can either raise your hand using the raise hand feature, which I think is currently under the reactions button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can also put things into the chat. And if you're having trouble figuring out how to get to the raise hand feature, just write in the chat, raise hand, and then we'll call on you that way. And they've been really wonderful conversations that we've now been having since April of 2020 online. We always like to begin these and all Blue Sky programs by acknowledging that Blue Sky Gallery occupies the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malala, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Wimal and Willamette rivers. In this online format, we know you may be participating from other areas, and we invite you to consider your own land acknowledgement that reflects your location. We also acknowledge that the very technology that we rely on for these programs is inequitably distributed and not equally accessible, which creates new virtual displacements and exclusions. And we'd like to call attention to the need for action now and in the future to address these disparities. And when I started doing these programs, which was in the gallery in 2018, I thought, you know, people come and they look at the photography and maybe you might talk to the person that you came into the gallery with about what you were seeing, but what if we could create bigger conversations and ways to help people connect and build community through what was hanging on the wall and also through pairing poetry, which we often do, with the photographs. And the point is really just to build our understanding together as we build connections with each other. So we're going to have some questions to discuss tonight, but these are not questions for which there is a right answer. So please don't feel pressed to come up with a right answer. Try and restrain the impulse to look things up on the internet as we're talking. Just be in conversation with each other and see what we can learn from each other. I always leave these conversations thinking differently about what we've discussed than when I came in, and I hope the same will be true for you. And as I mentioned, I started doing these programs at Blue Sky at the beginning of 2018 as part of the Robert Frank exhibition that was up, which had a whole range of programming associated with it. And as I was thinking about the work that's up in the gallery now, I thought it would be interesting to sort of juxtapose Robert Frank and Ingeborg Gerdes in terms of their work, because they're both immigrants to the US, one from Switzerland, one from Germany. And they really made their careers documenting America. So tonight's going to be both a sort of very in the moment of Blue Sky, because we'll be looking at the work that's up right now, which some of you may have seen and some of you may be looking forward to seeing in the coming weeks, but also looking back, pairing those works with some of Robert Frank's photographs. And I think I'll jump in and start sharing my screen so we can look at some images together. All right. Are you all seeing a photograph now? Yes, excellent. And now that the screen is being shared, we can't actually see everybody all at once. So again, if you want to, when you want to speak, please don't raise your actual hand, raise your virtual hand or use the chat. So maybe just sit with this photograph for a moment. It's from The Americans, the very famous book by Robert Frank. What is American about this photograph? That's the question I'll start us with. Take a moment, look, think, and let us know when you're ready to share some thoughts. And I suppose if your answer is nothing, it's universal, that's also worth sharing, but I thought I'd frame it in terms of Americans. Yu Yang, did you want to start us off?
Yeah, so looking at these photos, the first thing that came to my mind about America is the gas, the reliance on fossil fuel, and this big car culture, and presented in this photo by the presence of gas pumps and the gas sign, and even the title Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I actually learned the name of the city Santa Fe from a Hyundai SUV, which was named Santa Fe, which really speaks about like this whole whole thing that evolved around cars and car culture.
Yeah, the conflation of landscape and cars, which is visualized here, but marketed in that way. Chris, are you up next?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm just going to build on what Yang said, but I mean, the defining story of America was, it doesn't matter what you do here because you can always head west and there's more empty land that just has some people you can kill and get out of the way. And the sort of vast spaces of the American West were, kind of created our whole, along with the throwaway value of human life that we got from slavery, created the sort of America that we have now. And the idea that you could have this huge space that you were rattling around in your car with lots of cheap gas.
Right. So, and we've kind of talked a lot about the West as an American concept and deconstructing the West as an American concept, as well as the highway as an American concept. I feel like based on the really amazing shows that have been up at Blue Sky in the past 6 months, I think especially. So yes, this mythography of the West versus the reality of what that has meant in terms of destruction. Other thoughts about the Americanness of this photograph, and maybe also the 1955-ness of this photograph, because it is anchored in time in that way. Chuck, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. There's a fan running here, but I don't know what else is not out of is out of the view of the image, but this seems like the most minimal gas station I've ever seen. It's got a sign, it says save, and then there are just pumps out in the open air. Like I'm assuming you have to pay somewhere, but it seems somehow it's purely about function and putting the minimum there to be able to create a transaction to get gas. There's not, or to me, when I look at it, doesn't look like there's much of an effort at beauty, although someone had to design the gas pumps. That shamrock on the top obviously is not necessary to pump gas, so someone thought of that as a necessary part of the branding. But it's bizarre in a way, because everything else is just so minimal. Even the fact that it doesn't appear to be paved.
Oh yeah, that's an interesting point, right? Like, so there's road and there's gas to get you back on the road. There must be some building presumably somewhere, but as you said, we don't see it. Molly, what were you going to add?
Yeah, just sort of building on what Chuck said. I mean, it seems deserted. And so I don't know, when we think about, I think when we think about like the expanse of the West, we think about wide open spaces. But then the gas station adjacent to the wide open spaces, it just seems like it's a place that has been forgotten or lost or is no longer functioning. And it's about to turn over. We're sort of waiting for a new day for this place and space.
Yeah, I mean, Yu Yang started us off with the ubiquity of cars, or the deep car cultureness of America, but actually there aren't any cars here, which is also a fascinating part about this photograph. And does anybody want to nibble at this question about 1955? Craig?
Sure. No, I think that this is a good example of a picture whose meaning has changed over time. And I'm not sure we can quite see it the way that it was originally intended or made. That this seems kind of, I mean, it's very kind of romantic or kind of kind of old and nostalgic, and at the time these pumps were probably new. Also, my guess is the reason why you've got that shamrock light on the top is that earlier pumps, actually, you would pump the gas up into a container so you could kind of see how much you had. It would be marked with the amount, and then that would go down into your car. That was kind of how they measured the gas. So that's probably just a little bit of a holdover from that design. But I think it's just very difficult. I mean, to me, yeah, it really speaks 1955 right now. But in 1950, when this picture was made, it spoke today, I think.
Right. So that where we can't help but look at something with whether it's nostalgia or at least a historical lens. And it looks like Ken has put into the chat, there are so many gas pumps, which seems to indicate a difference between, and I think this echoes what Molly was saying, like a big demand at some point that seems to have completely disappeared by this moment. I see Lee and then Kirk.
I was just going to say that 1955 was a very important year. It was the year I was born, but also the photograph at the time, after World War II, before the 60s. This is the beginning of the baby boom, but this is such a lonely looking photograph. But that was contemporary to what Santa Fe would have been like in that time. But I also like the giant save, because that's so important in our culture, the dollars and save. What are you going to save? So.
Yes, and what are you expending in lieu of what you think you're saving? Yeah, I do think that that's right. That post-war moment is so important to think about the sort of where we are in America empire as a trajectory, and what that drives to in terms of this the expansiveness that Chris was alluding to earlier. Kirk, what was your thought?
Does anyone else see it completely outside of time as 5 robots, a little population united under their banner, which might be about money and might be about religion?
So you're suggesting that we need not read it so literally, but we can see whether it's metaphor or fantasy in it as well. And I like that idea that they have their own little community with each other and neither need nor care about us and our automotives. Heidi, what were you going to add? Oh, Heidi, you need to unmute.
Now?
Yay, yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think I froze up also. I have a comment. I actually have driven this part of the country, and what it brings to me is these are long stretches in between getting gas. And I've had the experience that I had to get used to, just because there's a town on the map doesn't mean that there's a gas station there. And so like this really expresses that whole vastness of that part of the country where there's a bunch of gas pumps there because you're like, thank God there's gas. And then you're not going to see one for another very long time. So I think, especially 1955, I've been there recently and in the last 15 years. So in 1955, I don't think there was as much traffic in the first place of people just zooming around out near Santa Fe down the highways. So that's kind of my take on it. It's not sad. It's happy to me. Wow, a gas station. And the fact that there's no cars right now I don't think there was necessarily, it's not like these times where you see people all pulling up to the pumps and there's 10 cars all like going and then zooming back off. So
Right. You remind us that the other thing we could be calling this is a service station, and you're so excited for the service that it offers. And I think, as you pointed out, what might be true today would be even more common in, the 1950s as sort of the building of the American highway system. In part, I think, under the aegis of a sort of civil defense project, right? We have to be able to move troops around, but we're really also coming to moving people around, and maybe not as, it's hard for us to remember the difference between the highway system at that moment and the highway system as we know it today.
Right.
Craig, is your hand back up?
Yeah. I think it's interesting that too, that Frank was building a narrative and trying to make a case, and there do not appear to be any cars here, but there was one car here.
Yes.
It was Robert Frank's, and he needed this service in order to do the project.
Yes, you remind me of the Salon from last year, where I was going on and on about the lack of a female presence in the photograph, and then Chris said, Lois, the photographer was a woman. There was definitely a woman sitting at the table when this picture was taken. I'm going to jump us to the next photograph, where I hope you will see my little mind at work. So maybe we should start with the questions of what is American about this photograph, and also what is 1982 about this photograph? Looks like Lee is ready to start us off.
Well, I was going to say, obviously, this is when photographers were moving more into color, and Ingeborg was certainly doing that well at this time. Again, you have that fossil fuel symbol and that kind of large expanse of empty space. Particularly American is part of the hysterical monument sign, which is pretty hysterical. But, part of Ingeborg's humor to pick that up.
Yeah. Other observations about this photograph? I've asked this Americanness question, but other questions and 1982ness, this also the idea of color. What work is color doing in this photograph? As you've just mentioned it. Chuck?
Well, I think you can see the red and white on the sign, both the signs, the round gas station sign and the hysterical monument. And then the person riding the horse is also white and red, and the sky is blue. So, I mean, if you're talking about kind of an Americanness, I guess if you want to be literal about it, you could say, well, there's a red, white, and blue. I'm also interested in what it says under hysterical monument, which I can't quite make out. It seems to say amber beacon on the third line, but I can't make out what it says on the second. Does anyone know?
It does feel like a bit of an eye chart, and I wonder if any of the Blue Sky staff who've spent more time in person with this know the answer to that.
Well, unfortunately, no. I don't know. In fact, it's brought to my attention now, but we'll have to get a magnifying glass and take it out to the print on the wall, see what we can find.
Which means that we're not necessarily meant to know it. Oh, Harper tells us it means, oh, it reads home of the infamous Amber Beacon, which I love because I can't tell if Amber Beacon is a thing or a person. For what has Amber Beacon earned infamy? We do not know.
I think she's on the horse.
This is pure speculation, I'm presuming, on your part. Is this, I'm also interested in thinking about what is this photograph doing that is they're similar to or distinct from the Frank photograph? Craig, what were you going to say?
Yeah, first of all, I keep coming back to the fact that it's a big dog and a small horse.
What's up with that?
It's just a little bit funny for some reason. That and there's kind of have very similar positions relative to the camera. So, yeah. Well, I think this picture is a lot more positive. I mean, it doesn't than the Frank picture.
In what sense?
Well, the Frank picture was made, well, of course it's black and white, and it just has a heaviness to it, and there's no one in it, and this has a young person in it, and and the animals, and it's just a lot more kind of engaged. I think the photographer is more engaged probably in the situation.
Okay, and we can also just say, for me, it reflects, without having to try and guess what either of our photographers were thinking or feeling at the moment, but just the effect of the photographs they've created. Heidi, what were you going to share?
I'm kind of building on Craig's I like the homegrown part of it. It's kind of like no need to impress. And when you said, the Frank picture seemed heavier and this seems lighter. To me, it's almost like the hand lettering, on that little building in the back. And then even the Texaco sign looks kind of simple. And there is just kind of this people out in the wide open spaces and being who they are and making their sign, and here we are. That feels American to me.
Yeah, the hand letterness of that sign, I think, is a significant thing. Thanks for drawing our attention to it. Chuck, and then Molly.
Two things. One is I just noticed the marvelous little cloud at the top left of the image, which is just like adorable. It's like sort of watching down over the dog and the horse and the person. But what I really wanted to say was both of these, when you kind of, this and the Robert Frank one, both, because they're gas stations, I guess, have this really flat piece of ground that's the foreground of the image, and then there's some landscape in the back. So you have this sort of utilitarian gas station plane, which I guess is the evidence, and we assume it's been flattened by human or machines to make that space, because it seems perfectly groomed and flat. So it's not a natural landscape, it's a human-made landscape. And it resembles to me nothing as much as a stage, like a theater stage, right? In both cases, it's like there's a painted backdrop, but then there's this sort of stage on which, in the Frank one, you have the pumps, which are the robots acting out whatever play they are. And in this one, the objects of the signs. And you could imagine like what, you try to imagine like what the opening lines even of what the robots or what the horse is going to say. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Okay, so there's the one and then the other. Oh, so many people waiting. Molly, Kirk, Harper.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point that Chuck brings up about the stage, because the differences I see in these two images is that there's more of an activation or participatory feeling with Ingeborg's image, as these three characters seem to look out beyond the picture frame and sort of engaging the viewer. Whereas I feel like with Frank, we're presented with this space and we are these neutral figures. But here it just seems to engage more with the viewer. So we're sort of, it's like a passing by, like almost like a window, and we look by and we see this image out the window. And here it seems more like that stage where we are engaged as audience because they're looking they're looking to us. And there's some emotion there. So
yeah, and I like that point of, it's not just that there are living beings that we see here. I'm presuming even if they're robots, they weren't living beings in the last photograph, but that they have both a physical positioning and a sight line that's sort of diagonal past where the viewer would be, that gives us, it implies a bigger picture or bigger action. Kirk, what were you going to say?
I was going to say that to me, it's about bigness and smallness. And Ingeborg's West always has a big wide view in it, and then small figures often placed like refrigerator magnets in what's Chuck called a big stage. And then all of the things that you look at individually and as particulars just turn out to be funny in her work.
Yeah, this is certainly one loaded with humor, which if they're frank is humor, it's a far drier humor. This is a wetter humor, I think. But and then when you were describing sort of the figure and the landscape, it made me think about not all landscape painting, but there's certainly a genre of landscape painting where it's very important to have that figure somewhere in the landscape to give you a sense of the enormity and immensity of nature. I thought I saw Harper's hand up, but Harper, have you removed yourself from the queue?
Oh, no, sorry. You called on me, so I thought you'd already seen me. Yeah, I think just kind of in comparing the two and thinking about the time frame of each of them, the first one, the Robert Frank, that kind of save really, I read into it almost like this manifest destiny, through expansion, through the highway system, American exceptionalism will arise. And then this one, it's almost like, okay, we built the highways. A lot of them lead to essentially places that most people would never venture. And so you have these ridiculous roadside attractions popping up to get people to come visit them. And I feel like that's where Ingeborg's kind of going, just there's this kind of just humorous ridiculousness about this image, the hysterical monument, as well as kind of just this in itself, this image being kind of a roadside attraction with the girl and the horse. And just kind of playing those two very different, attitudes of either image.
Right, and the roadside attraction is always actually intended not for you to save, but in fact for you to spend, right? That's why I have a roadside attraction, because you've got some coins jingling in your pocket as you drive by. And also, as Yu Yang started us off by saying about learning the name Santa Fe because it was a type of car, right? This one is called Somewhere, Nevada, and it feels like Somewhere, Nevada could just as easily be Nowhere, Nevada, right? That its lack of specificity. I mean, maybe there's a town called Somewhere, Nevada. I didn't check, but what does that name do in framing our experience of the picture? Chris, you've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, I was just going to build on what Molly said, that even though you, in your introduction, you said, these are both outsiders, one Swiss and one German. Robert Frank was much more of an outsider because he was a beatnik in the 50s, and he had to periodically pull strings to get himself released from jail where he'd been arrested because he was obviously a communist spy. So I think Ingeborg has much more of an insider's view, as Molly was saying, and it feels like this is made by a photographer who is connecting with their subject on a personal level, maybe sharing a joke with them, but certainly not at their expense.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Like, how does a photograph create that the joke is not at the subject's expense, but shared with? And I also feel like, to me, this photograph looks just, it gives me the impression, and I think maybe the quality of the color is part of it, of being much more of the picture that a tourist might have taken. Like I can remember those little cassette cameras, with the flash cubes that spun around, that I probably had on some family vacation driving through the West circa 1982. I'm not saying I was going to take this picture, but it feels it feels like it's almost out of the vacation photo album in a way that feels less formal to me. And I'm not quite sure why. And again, I'm not saying anything about how it was actually taken. I'm saying something about the emotional effect it has for me. Shall we look at another picture? So again, we might think about what strikes you about the photo overall, and particularly this question of its Americanness, and maybe how it connects to the other photos that we've been looking at. Chris?
Well, yeah, I mean, it certainly connects up with the sort of car culture that you know, everything was being based on. But also, I mean, if you think about the American West, what do you think about? You think about Western movies, basically. And so having this sort of, this is the place where the mythical West, where the Marlboro Man roams, meets up with the 50s West, where the Cadillacs roam. This is the meeting place.
Yeah, we don't have to imagine that gas tanks or gas pumps are robots, because here it's clear that the cars are the people who've gone out to the show. And even thinking about, we at this moment associate filmmaking, you know, the notion of Hollywood is the place that films came from, but that was not necessarily originally true. There were movie studios in New Jersey and other places, but that there's a sort of condensing of the production of film and television by the 1950s as also a product of the West. Other things that strike folks about this photo? Craig?
Yeah, also, again, you know, today that this is very nostalgic. The old cars, we know we sort of have as a totally different meaning than when it was made. Those were newish cars at the time, and then that was probably a more of a current movie. And drive-ins had not disappeared.
Yeah, it would be a much more common way to go see a film. Chuck?
I guess I'm wondering what Frank's experience with going to the movies was, and whether the drive-in was this particularly American thing for him with his European eyes. And, you know, this thing that kind of combines the two great parts of American culture, the like American cinema and American cars. I also wonder, it seems like it's still light out, which is, I'm assuming that was what they did when the started to get dark, they would show the movie. Maybe that means there were multiple movies a night and they just wanted to start early. I really don't know, but it's interesting to me. It seems like that would have to be awfully bright image to be able to see it with that amount of light in the sky, but there it is.
Yeah, and I mean, you drew our attention to the clouds in the earlier image, right? This what is the expanse of sky doing here, particularly because the screen itself is not the center, is not centered in the photograph, right? So where are we supposed to be looking, or how are we supposed to think about what's supposed to, or what's the effect on us, I should say, of these kind of three things to look at: the cars, which are sort of the immediate foreground but lower section of the photo, and then the screen with its cursive writing on the other side, presumably an advertisement we can't read, and then the expanse of sky and the way that the sky is positioned, and the other things are positioned in relation to the sky. Chris, what were you going to add?
Yeah, I was gonna say yes. I've never seen a drive-in in Europe. Maybe they had some and I just missed them, but I did see outdoor theaters. But you would walk up to them and sit in like a town square and watch a movie. So this was I'm sure a startling thing for a European coming here, the idea that you would sit in your car and go to a movie. I did go to a drive-in movie when I was in India in the 70s, but we had the only car there. Everybody else had walked in, but they did have a place for cars.
Spot the American. Craig?
Yes, well, two things. As one who did go to drive-in movies in my youth, it was the case that in the summer, the drive-in movies would have to start before it got dark because the days were longer.
Right.
And second of all, I've never heard anyone mention this, and I don't know whether it is relevant, but he wasn't just a European, he was also a New Yorker. And in New York, they don't have drive-ins. In New York, they don't have gas stations that look like that. So, there's probably a little bit of an East Coast focus. I think there was an interview with Bruce Davidson once, and who was also a New Yorker, and he mentions going to Los Angeles and saying how they ate hamburgers out of tiny mailers. That was kind of an odd way to look at that.
And so that's also interesting to think about because Ingeborg Gerdes lived in San Francisco, so is a immigrant Westerner as opposed to an immigrant New Yorker, as we're thinking across these pictures. Any more thoughts on this one before we jump to the next?
I was just going to also add that in the 50s, you didn't normally go to a single movie, you went to a double bill. Again, to talk about why it might not be completely dark.
Yeah. Also would be much harder to take the photo, I suppose, if it were fully dark out. So those of you who've seen the show that's up in the gallery can probably guess which photograph I've put next to pair with this one. So again, we might think about the Americanness of this photo, the 1982-ness of this photo or not. How is this photo similar to or distinct from the Robert Frank photo we were just looking at? Chuck?
I would say, well, first of all, it's showing Star Wars in 1982 and the movie came out in 1977. So unlike the drive-in, we're talking about which was then in 1955 in Frank's image, up to the minute current, that old house next to the theater and the theater itself have a sort of rundown. Time has passed and things have seen maybe better days, and even the future of Star Wars, or this imagined future or mythological future, is sort of takes place within this little bit, old and run down and sort of cobbled together. One of the things I like about this picture the best is the white house at the top of the gable onto our right. They've sort of cobbled on a little attic next to the theater, which is I love. Like, was the house part of the theater? Is it just built up against it so they could get a storage space? It's amazing.
Yeah, so I'm going to pull out a few things from what you said. One is, right, this is not Space, the Final Frontier. I'm mixing my Star Wars and Star Treks, but because, as you said, this is Star Wars is supposed to represent a futuristic, but also that space becomes sort of a substitute in some ways, literally with the space program, but also metaphorically in popular culture for like the next place to conquer, having conquered with all the problematics of that concept, the American West. But yeah, the interesting thing about, there are a bunch of buildings that we see in this photograph. I would call the white building adjacent to the theater a structure. I'm not 100% sure that it's a house, particularly looking across the first floor. It might be or have been a commercial structure just based on what the doors and windows look like. But what is the relationship between those two buildings? I think is a good one for us to be asking. I see Chris and then Molly.
I believe that White House says Opera House on it.
I'm going to lean in really close.
Above the right-hand window. So that was all one establishment.
Or like we used to go to the opera and now we go to see Star Wars.
Yeah.
Nice. Molly, what were you going to add?
Well, I was going to say that this photo of Ingeborg's, I feel, is closer in the emotion to closer to Frank's gas station picture. This notion of the deserted and the bygone era, and even though at that time it wasn't for Frank, but in terms of how we see it as deserted and at one point active, and so very much a contrast to Frank's image of the drive-in movie. That this is a sad yet also a beautiful image, because I think formally it's very interesting. That's what draws me to it. The formal qualities of the work. So
hold that thought, because I may come back and ask you to say more about it. But Lee, what were you going to add?
I was just going to say, one of the things I love about this photograph is that those two buildings seem to be holding each other up.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically one shape, and you get the feeling that if either one of those buildings weren't there, the other would just collapse.
That right, that attachment is a deep attachment, and Ken has observed via the chat. We have this newly painted red curb, which first of all, on a formal level, looks great with the pinkness of the theater and is communicating to us, definitely don't park here, even though, as Molly said, the theater seems to be deserted. Maybe that is why it is playing what is still listed on the marquee is Star Wars, even though that film had come out years earlier. And I'm guessing that because in the places where we ought to see movie posters, it looks like there's just, blank slates, in the same way that there's nothing advertised in the Opera House next door. And Molly, did you want to say a little bit, or can I get you to say a little bit more about what is the appeal, the formal appeal about the photo?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at all sort of the intersecting lines, the parallel lines. I'm looking at what I guess are telephone wires or electrical wires above, and that kind of intersection that then sort of creates this triangle on the corner of the facade of the theater, and then the shape of the roof, the kind of the top of the roof of the adjacent house. But then, and so they're very hard lines, but then you have this more organic hillside in the background. I don't know, it's just an interesting juxtaposition there, but then the line of the red that you mentioned, the fire lane, and then the line of the street, even the pathway to the right of the building as it curves down. I don't know, it's so interesting. It's just so, and then the line on the side of the building, there's just so much to look at. And then even perspective, like and maybe it's the building itself that makes it so interesting, but also the way and the perspective and point of view from which it's captured that makes you see all of these things around every corner.
Yeah, as you're describing these different elements, what's striking me is that this is in some ways a very still photograph, right? No people, no animals, no cars, no motion, and yet there's so much going on. I hope we will also draw our attention to the other buildings that we have not yet talked about, which seem to be more modern and occupied houses. But I see that Kirk has got a hand up. Kirk, what did you want to share? You're muted. You need to unmute.
There, I was still stuck on the main theater building and pink. And the color palette is so gentle and muted, and the pink seems so gross and in your face, in contrast to the old building and the lovely hillside behind it. And I think the color is a lot of what makes the image work.
Yeah. So what strikes you as garish in a color choice is also perfect in a photographer's choice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and of course, again, like if my goal is to have a roadside attraction, I do want to catch your eye. I don't want you to pass by without thinking about how much you want to stop in and see a film. And Ken has noted the strange position of the marquee in the theater. And I think part of that is that actually we're only seeing part of the marquee. I'm guessing, now maybe I'm wrong. I keep leaning into my, like I'm going to be able to see in the third dimension. That there might be another side. There's the sort of stripes and emblem on the front. And I wonder whether there's another marquee on the other side that we just can't see from this angle. And that's part of why that relationship looks so odd to us, that it's just a distortion based on where the photograph is taken from, but that's just a guess. Chuck, did you want to add something?
Just a note on the pink. I mean, the one thing that whether intentionally or not is up to the minute is that that's essentially postmodern pink, which might have been coming into its own in 1982. Though I don't know, that the person who put that or either put the paint on or asked to have the paint put on was aware of current fashions and architecture at the time. But there it is, up to the minute.
That's interesting. And I am really struck by how sort of bland the buildings that I'm assuming are houses next to these two buildings, right? The brown one in the foreground and then the white one with what I think is a green roof in the background seem to be, compared to the opera house structure, is really interesting to me because of the time period it's from. And even the gem, as we've been talking about, it has all of these elements to it that are meant to echo grander movie theaters, perhaps movie palaces, perhaps. And just like how completely nondescript those houses and their windows seem to me. Craig, what did you want to add?
It's interesting that the paint, the wonderful Pepto-Bismol pink, appears to be recent. It does not appear to be worn anywhere. So someone, there's an optimism there. There's someone actually sort of spent a lot of money and a lot of effort, a lot of time, sort of restoring this up to a point, because we still have, it looks like plywood in the windows. And also, I did check, and apparently Gem was like a theater chain of some sort. There are still a number of Gem theaters around the country.
You're supposed to act like you remembered that, since I told you not to look things up on the internet, Craig. You should just say, in my vast expertise, I happen to know that Gem was a theater chain. I believe some still exist, right? And that building is also not entirely pink, right? So there's the ticket booth. It seems to be different colors. I mean, it's more than one color on the ticket booth, so that there's, trim has been painted here as well as the building as a whole. Other thoughts on this one before we move on? Chris?
I was just going to say that I find that pink to be somewhat like some version of a flesh color. To me, it makes the building feel like a little being that's alive.
We're definitely looking for little beings in the photos tonight. I wouldn't call it flesh colored, but I also would not call it Pepto-Bismol colored. I feel like that's a pinker pink. But let's take a look at the next one that's here. And how do we read this photo, maybe on its own and or in relation to the other ones that we've been discussing? Chris?
Well, it's from a more distanced, emotionally distanced point of view from the photographer. So it's more of an outsider than an insider picture.
What to you is conveying emotional distance?
Well, I mean, you don't see anybody's faces. The guy's got a car door between you and him. It feels like I'm so detached from the picture that my reflection doesn't even show up in the car window. it just feels like there's not an emotional connection. If you think about the way we felt about that girl on the small horse, we felt like we were connecting with her in a nice way. And I even felt like I was connecting with that gem movie theater.
Right.
Person to person, so.
So right, it's interesting because you use the term distance when, of course, this is probably the one with the least physical distance, right? The photographer is presumably very close to the car and the person, but the way that the line of the photograph, as you said, cuts off the face, right? We have a chin, we don't have eyes, we don't have mouths, we don't have, we could not possibly recognize who that person is. We could eliminate some suspects based on race and gender, perhaps, but that's about it. And that the corridor is physically blocking us. And yes, there is something strangely like a vampire took this picture. I mean, I can't figure out where the photographer was standing, but the absence of the reflection when we see another reflection is weirdly disconcerting, I think, in some ways. Molly, what were you going to add?
Well, I feel like there's more ambiguity here in this. I mean, we can identify what we're looking at, but ambiguous in terms of what this is about. And I think that makes it intriguing as well, too, because it forces us to maybe look at more of the details and see the relationship between all of the objects or people or partial objects and partial people that are captured, or the lines or the splatter that's on the ground. So it kind of draws your attention to some of the things that, I think that are not readily available in total. And so it forces us to look at this deconstructed image in a different way, but it leaves ambiguity, but opportunity.
Yeah, and Ken has added in the chat, on the one hand, we have this featureless face, but then a very strong gesture of the hands. So physicality is important here. Physicality is communicating here, even though we lack the face, which is where we would expect our eyes to go in a picture with a person in it. Craig?
Yeah, this picture to me kind of speaks to, it's almost like a photographer's Olympics. It's like the photographer is saying, I can make this great picture out of nothing, that this everyday moment that I saw this, and I saw this in an instant and made a picture. I mean, it's really pretty impressive. It has very little actual kind of, the moment was not that significant probably, but the picture is great.
And I think also part of what may be contributing to that sense that you're getting is also that we've been looking at pictures that are very much about that the pictures we've looked at up to this point feel very much like I'm traveling to a particular place. I'm now realizing that when we were talking about the drive-in, we didn't even mention that it was Detroit, right? The Motor City is where that is. And so this really does feel maybe a little bit more like not a traveler passing through, but an everyday scene, even though we have no idea where the photographer is in relation to what's been photographed in terms of whether this is just a passing through moment or not. Chuck, what were you going to add?
So many questions in this. One, if this person with the suit is getting in or out of the car, why is their jacket buttoned up? Are they just getting into the car? That seems unusual. Why is the driver's seat pushed forward as if they're taking something in or out of the back seat? Which appears to be and you can see just below the person's left hand to the right of the door, it's a Mercury Cougar car, which it looks like, I'm not sure that if that's intentional, that it's framed or not. It's like a 2-door Cougar from the time, I think. And then most interesting to me of all is on the window of the driver's door, it looks like a telephone pole with some wires, and then this hint of hill or landscape at the bottom horizon of the glass of the driver's door, or at least that's what it looks like to me in the reflection.
Yeah, that if you are just looking at all the rest of the picture, this feels like it could be very urban or suburban, right? Because all we are seeing is pavement and pavement and pavement and cars and cars and pavement. But there is nature in this photograph. You just have to look, you have to look into the car or into the window of the car in order to see the reflection of the landscape back.
It's like the narrative that I want to construct is that this guy is trying to sell the car, but it doesn't look like a car lot from the way that the parking stripes are set up.
And also the variety of different types of cars. But I like that you honed in on the Cougar and now are ready to make perhaps a purchase price offer on the Cougar. This photograph is not titled or dated. If I were a gotcha sort of person, which I try not to be, I would have tried to have you guess, if you didn't already know, which of the photographers this is, because it is Ingeborg Gerdes, even though we have only seen color work from her this evening. It is not in the black and white world of the Robert Frank images that we've been looking at. But how does not knowing information and an untitled, undated photograph shape our reading or our response to the image, as opposed to the Detroit Drive-In or the Santa Fe, New Mexico? How does the absence of information shape your reading? Chris?
Well, I would say it opens up a greater possible number of readings, and if you have a title, a good title will generally give you more interpretations of the picture, and a bad title will generally shut you down while you could have still been thinking of other things that the picture might mean to you.
You remind me of an MD I know who likes to paint in the MD's spare time, but doesn't like the paintings to hang anywhere, because also writes on the back of the painting exactly what the painting means. And if you hang it, you can't see what it means. You can only see the painting, right? So I think an extreme version of your notion of the title, the title doing the wrong work of limiting the possibility of the picture, as opposed to untitled opening up every possibility. Any other thoughts on the untitledness or any other aspect of this photo? Craig?
Well, I have to say, when I first saw it, I figured it was not Robert Frank because I had never seen it, but also the way the content is, but also it's printed in a way that Ingeborg would print. I've always, I don't think anyone ever prints quite like she does. There's this wonderful way she deals with kind of highlight detail and I don't know, there's kind of a richness, but a you know, kind of restrained quality to it that I've always just really admired.
For people who are less familiar with her work, can you give us maybe more specifics about what you're talking about that we might see in this picture, or some of the ones we looked at, in terms of her print style being so distinctive?
Well, I mean, for one thing, they're very consistent. She has enormous control, but also, and it's working in this 35 millimeter style where the, you know, and the grain is always, you know, kind of sharp, but especially in the highlights where if you'll notice the way, I guess technically speaking, it's the, you know, the film has the toe and the shoulder in the curve, the way it renders tones, and she really knew how to deal with those light areas to sort of keep detail there. As it flattens out, it's never harsh. It's sort of there's a gentleness to it. It's really very hard to do without making it look kind of really flat, and yeah. I don't. That's probably not a very good explanation. I'll bet Kirk can. I'll bet Kirk can say something.
Kirk, do you wish to be volunteered at this time?
May have wandered off.
And Karen had noted when we were talking about the untitledness, the sense of freedom about exploring one's own feelings in relation to the image, that the title can feel limiting. And I think that's really, I mean, that is always something that I'm interested in these conversations, is how do each of us as individuals respond to these images that we look at, our poems when we are looking at those, and how does the what's the relationship between what is produced by a photographer, a poet, an artist of any sort, versus what effect it has on each of us. Maybe when I bring up the next picture, it will help us see a little bit by contrast what Craig was just talking about. And obviously, again, I was sort of thinking about the last photograph we looked at, and one of the better known Frank photographs that I might pair with it, and this one came to mind. I feel like I may have actually, when I did I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure that we talked about this one in the gallery when the Frank exhibit was up for that program. But how do we read this photograph either on its own or in relation to the last one that we discussed? Chris?
Well, it's much more emotionally connected. I mean, you're not looking at these people as a bunch of suits. You're looking at them as people who are in contemplation, and it appears to be a funeral. You know, they're kind of, you feel an emotional empathy with the people in the picture, I think, and I think that's in the Americans generally. He feels a connection to the Black subjects in the book much more than the white subjects, if you kind of go through the book.
Yeah, although I'm interested in how the positioning of these figures, right? If we had seen this last person, if we'd seen their face, maybe the head is turned slightly to the side, but we'd be looking at them more or less straight on. Certainly the shoulders are straight on, so we'd get more than 3/4 of the face. Whereas here we're seeing primarily, certainly for the figure who's closest to us and the next closest figure to us, the sides of their faces. And what's the effect for you as a viewer? Chris talked about an emotional connection with these subjects, but how does the actual position of their faces and their bodies shape that sense of emotional connection or not emotional connection, depending on what it is for you? Chris?
Well, I hate to leap in again, but I mean, for me, I feel like I'm being given permission to look at these people. I'm not expected to interact with them. They have their side to me. They're not facing toward me. I grew up in New York, and on the subway in New York, there's this thing where you can look at somebody on the subway and they'll kind of look away and let you look at them, and then they look over at you and you have to look away and let them look at you, you know? So maybe I'm used to that, you know. When I moved out west, I'd be on the freeway and I'd look at a car passing me and they would jerk their head around like, "What are you doing? You're looking at me." So I think there's a sense of that I'm being given permission to look at these people and think about them in a way that I wouldn't be if they were facing me.
So, and I guess part of that is it's not, as you said, confrontational, like your freeway confrontations. It's not confrontational. There also seem to be in relation to each other. There's a figure that we can't see, right? Who's almost entirely cut out of this frame, but who's also there. So this idea that
well, they're standing in a circle, and I, standing in Robert Frank's shoes as the viewer, am also standing in the circle. So that's part of what makes me feel connected. Is I'm the next person in the line.
Yeah. Craig?
Yeah, I think also they're clearly at an event and they're all facing the same direction. So they're sort of attending a presentation or something is going on. And they're all looking in that direction, but they're also deep in their own thoughts, which adds a soberness to it. And they're not looking bored. They're just looking like they're remembering. And I think that's kind of what makes it, gives it that emotional quality to me.
Yeah, I'm going to connect to that in a second, but I wanted to read out what Victoria's put in the chat. The luminosity is very different in this picture than the previous image, which it glows here. It feels like the dark absorbs and while so close, but not engaging the viewer. So there is just looking at, again, to come back to or connect with what Craig was saying earlier about the print quality, but also just the way that obviously even in black and white photos, color means something. Chris, you've got your hand up and then I'll jump to the thing I was going to say.
Oh, sorry, I think my hand was still just left up.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I think 35 millimeter photographers tended to print like Robert Frank because everybody wanted to do everything like Robert Frank. And the way Ingeborg printed, what Craig is talking about with the sort of soft and suppleness of the highlights and stuff, is more the way view camera photographers would render highlights with it, or platinum on platinum prints. There was a sense of kind of keeping a velvety smoothness and to stay away from the sort of contrastier treatment.
Yeah, and Lee has added in the chat that both of these images are very much about the gesture, right? The hands were so important, as Ken pointed out in the last photograph, but here they're very much attached to the face. The angles that the heads are looking, we couldn't really tell in the last one, but heads looking up, heads looking down are meaningful here. And I have been slightly heavy-handed in not giving you the title of this image, although Chris may have done a little bit of a spoiler on it, but it is indeed a funeral that he's photographing. And I wonder how that title shapes our reading of the photo, especially because we were talking before about the idea of the untitled giving us more space to interpret or more space to have our own emotional responses. What does knowing that this is a funeral in St. Helena, South Carolina, do as a added on piece of information after you've already had time to sit with and experience the photo? I could say that for me, it makes this sort of emotional intimacy or the emotional closeness that we were talking about. I think Chris started us off in talking about in this photo, even more profound, right? To be let into the space of the funeral feels like it doesn't feel like I'm intruding on a moment of community grieving. It feels like I'm respectfully or gracefully participating in it. And I can't even quite say why. Maybe because of where we stand in the circle or how the figures are positioned in relation to the viewer. Heidi, what were you going to add?
I actually preferred it before I saw the title. It's much more intimate to me without the title. And yeah, I agree with Chris. To me, it looks obviously like a funeral. So I kind of like felt that in the first place. And there's something about putting a title on it that all of a sudden makes me like almost, oh, now I'm looking from a distance. Now I'm looking at something in a book, or I'm looking at a photograph that's on the wall, instead of when you showed it without the title, you can fully experience the emotion and the image.
I like that you felt like you could guess what it was, but the title made it too definitive. Chris, what did you want to add?
Well, I was going to say, we did a show by Adrian Chesser, who was a young gay man who had AIDS, and he did a project where one by one he had his friends come into the studio saying he wanted to make portraits of them, And he would start photographing them and then say, I have something to tell you, and tell him that he had AIDS and that he was probably going to die soon. And just continued to photograph them while they processed it. And it was very interesting because he said, there's this point where people are connecting with you, and then there's this point where they go inside and they go into their own headspace and break contact with you and just have this purely internal moment. And that's what feels like is happening in this picture. These people have gone inside.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to them?
But also that it is inside might seem very isolated or individualistic. And to me, it feels like there is a sense of community. We don't know whose funeral or what relationship the people that we're looking at have to the person whose funeral it is. But there seems to be a collective experience that they're having. We also don't know whether somebody is actually speaking at this moment, which is quite possible. And so they're responding both to the overarching idea of this person has passed, but also to the words being said about this person or about this person's passing.
Or the hymn being sung or whatever.
Yeah, that's precisely. Do you guys want to hang on for 2 more images? Are you in? Are you in? Some more. Feel free to go at any point. You don't have to stay. I hope you've gotten your money's worth. Oh, it was great. The same questions maybe that we've been talking about. This is an untitled picture, but it is indicated that it's the Mission District in San Francisco, and there's a date range for it. So maybe what is American about this photograph, and what is 1984 to 1993 about this photograph? And or how do we want to read it in connection with the other images we've been looking at? Craig?
Well, one thing I noticed is that she, well, I mean, it's kind of the traditional rule in photography is that you have a subject kind of looking, you put more space in the frame in front of them. So they have kind of space to look into. And she's not doing that there. We have the person centered. So the other part of the, I mean, that gives a sense, I think, of kind of almost the picture being just sort of made so quickly there wasn't time to compose, which is interesting because also the one of the gas station and was the same. The pony and the woman were centered, and then the other person was the dog. I'm sorry, the dog was off to the left, and that all it was on the other half of the picture almost was the Texaco sign. And I think it's interesting the way she uses that device sometimes to kind of activate the frame in a way that makes it sort of less traditionally composed and more active, maybe.
Yeah, again, it feels more like a moment captured, maybe than the time for it to be composed slowly, carefully, because there are living beings that we're catching. I see Chris and then Chuck.
Yeah, I mean, for me, what's American about this picture is this sort of sense of this sort of combination of the melting pot and the idea that as an American, you don't have to follow traditions and rules and all this stuff. And I feel like you look at the sort of clothing and the stances, and the women in this picture don't look like the way they're supposed to look. And that's fine. And that's American to me.
The way that who thinks they're supposed to look.
Exactly.
I think they're very convinced that they're looking exactly how they're supposed to look, but that they're not, as you said, sort of, that's a, maybe not just self-defined in an individual sense, but that in the universe in which they move, that is exactly how they ought to look.
Right. Their peers think they look just the way they're supposed to look. And they think that's the way they're supposed to look, but they don't care about anybody else.
Right. And we get that sense of peers, especially because there are two figures there. We assume they don't happen to just be standing next to each other, that they are moving through the city together. Chuck, what were you going to say?
I think, this is my imagined narrative, but if it is 1984 to 93, this looks like a still from a music video. And when I look at it, it has that kind of energy, like it's close up on the people in it. They have like a defiant arms crossed pose. And the energy for me in this image is all about the vanishing point at the left center of the image. So you see, and the heads of the two people in the foreground are, if you follow at the top right, there's the train wires that the buses in San Francisco get their energy from. You follow those down left, those sort of just go right through their heads, and then beyond, just to the left of that shed-like structure, that's the sort of vanishing point of the left and right streetscapes. And also it adds to it is the motion of the car. The car is almost perfectly framed. You see almost the whole car. And then there's a barricade just to the right of the car. Also, it has that same energy of the lines of perspective going back into the back of the image. This is a great picture.
It's interesting. Clearly, Chuck wants his MTV because he thinks this is a still from a music video. But I'm also interested, particularly in. I feel like in a few years we will have to explain to people what the Pacific Bell is. That is a phone booth, or we've stopped having full phone booths. I think that's just one of those little phone shelters. But something also about the way in which the arms are crossed, and that there's these two figures that are clearly related, but one behind the other in nearly the same pose. I also feel like they could just be superheroes who have emerged from that Pacific Bell, and that this is their superhero costume. Like they are ready to conquer the world. But that may just be my deep desire to create a different narrative for them. Molly, was your hand up?
Well, actually, I was just going to comment on Pacific Bell because I mean and when I saw that, I was attracted to that. But first of all, I lived in the Mission in '93, and my mom worked for Pacific Bell, so I can tell that story about Pacific Bell as an offshoot of AT&T. And yes, it looks like it's probably an old phone booth, but and Pacific Bell is no longer. So in any case, it brings up a lot of memory, or it just shows the power of image and sign in our both our collective conscience and our personal experience. So she does well to capture that.
Yeah, and I want to also, Chuck mentioned the car, and that is like this ginormous car. When we're talking about American car culture, this is another moment when American cars, which have gotten gigantic again, in terms of the car that we see in this photo. And Karen in the chat has noted that these two women in the photo are wearing essentially the same outfit. They're not matching outfits, but they've both got on jeans, a particular style of very baggy jeans. And if you look at the cut of their shirts, the woman who's slightly farther away from us, and I'm not even sure if I want to call them women, I can't tell, they might be teens, and I don't want to adultify them, has got a sweatshirt on over it, but that the actual line of the shirts is the same line, even though one is got bold stripes and one of them appears to be either white or a very pale solid color. And for me, Molly, when you were talking about living in the Mission in this time period, I lived not quite in the Mission, but I first laid eyes on the Mission in 1990 when I moved to San Francisco after college. And the Mission today, I don't think looks anything like this, right? That this is also a moment before, in the same way that we have to explain phone booth because phones have to be attached to things called wires, and that world is not the world that we live in anymore. That this is also a world before the economy and geography of San Francisco in general, and the Mission in particular, is transformed by the technology push that happens in the 1990s through our own moment. So to me, this feels as nostalgic a time as looking at some of the Robert Frank photos from decades earlier. Chris?
Yeah, I just want to agree with you. The Mission District was very lively, powerful Chicano neighborhood. I mean, walking down the main drag of it was like traveling to another country. I mean, it was really wonderful. And of course, now it's completely gentrified, and nobody could afford anything there. But that was the last area in San Francisco that a normal human being could afford to live.
And I have not unconsciously led us to looking at these last couple of photos at not just bodies, but thinking about the photographs of Black and Brown Americans, and do we find ourselves reading them differently than other of the images that we've looked at tonight? And certainly in the course of these salons, both the ones in the gallery and the ones that we've been doing online, we have seen lots of photographs of Black and brown bodies, lots of photographs by photographers of color. So I don't mean to just pick these out in isolation, but I do wonder about it, and just what does it mean, our reading of their reading of America? Because you said earlier, you feel like in some ways in the Americans, the Black subjects seem to be the ones that Frank identifies with most closely. Do we have a sense of that here? Are we identifying with, objectifying? What's our relationship to these figures? And Kirk says, in some ways that for his reading, at least, these seem to be like two framed portraits amidst an almost chaotic scene. I think that's true, but I think it's really important that they're also embedded in that scene. When we're talking about the Mission and the street culture of the Mission, like I can hear that car. We see other people walking, represented primarily by this figure, but that to me, and even the fact that the figure in front, her hair seems to be windswept, that they are constructed in that scene. If they're portraits, the placement of them in this landscape is a really important part of the portraits being made of them, for me at least. Kirk has told me that I'm right, so I feel really good about myself. Chris, say some more.
Well, I was going to say that I don't read them as brown and white people. I read them more. I think to me, what you said earlier about they look like superheroes that just emerged out of the phone booth in their crime fighting uniforms, to me has more resonance emotionally. I mean, I feel like they're really emerging as individuals, but part of a cohort, part of a generation that says, okay, we're not going to stand for this. We're going to do things our way. And I find that very powerful. And I like it that there's that it's a rainbow coalition.
Yeah, and also interesting to think about it in terms of the time frame. American immigration law changed dramatically in 1965, basically undoing many of, but not all of the explicit and implicit racial restrictions on immigration. So America has become much more diverse in the years since 1965, and also not long after, interracial marriage becomes legal in every state in the union, which also changes up we'd always had biracial Americans or interracial Americans, but that there is a different sense of America. And I think for some people that feels really wonderful and something to celebrate. And for other people, it feels really frightening. I celebrate it. But when you talk about their generation, I also think of them as that post-1965 American generation. Any other thoughts on this one before we take one last look, at which point I will confess something to you? Was that a good hook?
Exciting.
Yeah. So part of the reason I wanted to think, I mean, I love this photograph in many ways for all the reasons that people have been talking about, but it also made me think back to this image from the from Frank, an image that I don't know if I knew it, though I knew many of the other images from the Americans, if I knew it before I saw it at Blue Sky in 2018. But I have always read or wanted to read these figures as Latinx. And even when I was leading the gallery discussion, I actually paired this with a poem to sort of draw that out. And I might have been the only one who was doing that reading. So I'm interested also in my interest in reading maybe that level of diversity into Robert Frank's vision of the Americans in the way that it's already become much more explicit by the time we get to Ingeborg Gerdes's vision of America. You don't have to, I mean, you don't have to tell me whether you think I'm right or wrong, but how do we read this image particularly in relationship to that image? Chris?
Well, I see them as being very comfortably loving, but wary that they're out in the street and that it's maybe not quite safe for them there.
What gives you that impression?
Well, we talked about Ingeborg having her subjects looking out of the frame. Craig talked about it quite a bit, but they're somehow, to me, they look guarded, like it's us two against the world a little bit. And I don't know exactly what gives me that impression, but that's the impression I get.
Right, the very closeness of them figures both the way that they're standing, not just near each other, but sort of one in front of as well as next to the other, the darkness of their clothing against the many other people in lighter clothing. That, as Victoria points out, all the other figures that we see are walking the other way. So they're sort of against that tide. Other thoughts about this image? Heidi?
My first take on this was the country girl who has dressed up to come to the city and is not totally comfortable, like as a couple. I don't really see them as city people. I see them as, I have that same feeling of, yes, they don't feel comfortable. And there's this anticipation, but I'm not sure if it's racial or ethnic, or it feels, her in particular, feels like someone who is not comfortable being in the city, and she's wearing her appropriate clothes, but doesn't feel a part of this group.
Victoria has said that their expressions feel really tense. And I think that that's part of it, right? Is that there seems to be, especially on the female figure, a sense of wariness. So I'm also interested in the openness of his jacket and his hand in his pocket, and whether that's defensiveness or confidence. Your reading of her in her dressed up clothes, like, to me, that there's so much elegance. I love the coat. I love the handbag, even though the clasp of it, I think, does contribute to that sense of protectiveness, right? I don't have my clutch purse off to the side. I'm holding it tightly in front of me with both hands. That the scarf seems incredibly gorgeous, both in terms of its fabric, what I can sort of read of it, but also there's an elegance to the way that it's tied, and yet still showing off this, what I can only assume is an incredibly time-consuming hairdo to get done. So maybe that's part of why I wanted to keep talking about this photograph 3.5 years later, is I feel like there's a fair bit of mystery for me in it. And now I started us out this evening sort of saying we have immigrants looking at America, and what are we learning from their looks at America? And I guess maybe worth, as usual, we've taken way more time than I always think we're going to, but I have so much fun, I don't stop. I hope those of you who wanted to slip away are gone. But any final reflections on sort of the juxtaposition of these two photographers or these particular images from their work as we've had them? Are you all done? It's too hot, it's too late, we're too hungry, we're too tired, Lois. Well, thank you for indulging me on this one. I found it really interesting to look at their work together and just think about the ways to pull them in. Ken has given me permission. He says, too hot, but great photos. So on that note, Molly, Harper, C, do you guys want to say anything about when folks they can't see this one in the gallery, so we should not end on, when folks can see this and other great things in the gallery currently and what's coming up?
Yes, certainly. So this show is on view through August 28th. So please come down to the gallery. We're open Wednesday through Saturday from 12 to 5 p.m. We are requiring masks, as is the mandate now and across the state. So please bring your mask, and we have extras in case you forget yours. And we actually hosted our first Thursday for this show since March of 2020. People were very eager to get out. So by that I mean we were open a few hours later than we would on Thursday. And our intention is to do that for our next shows in September, but we'll continue to keep our eye on things. We're back to looking at numbers again, but our hope is that we can have a live first Thursday. Our shows in September are Gary Burnley coming from New York and Al J. Thompson also coming, or actually he won't be coming, but Gary Burnley will be coming and doing a live artist talk in the gallery on first Thursday, 5 p.m. on that Thursday. So just stay tuned to our social media, our website to get all the updated information and other programming as well. So we'll look forward to seeing you. And Lois, thank you so much for your time and expertise and leading us in conversation and getting us to think more deeply about the images. So,
as I say at the beginning every time, we build community in these conversations, and I never leave without thinking more deeply about what we've been looking at and talking about because of all of your comments. So thanks to all of you, and have a great hot evening.
It's also very cool in the gallery, so don't hesitate to come down.
Although maybe not this evening.
Yeah, not this evening. I'm going home now, so you can't come this evening, but we'll see you tomorrow at noon.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.